constraints since we lost Dr. Goldratt. It's been Alan's been one of the leaders in continuing to advance the knowledge, and he's going to share that with you all today. So, Alan, thanks for joining us. The session's yours.
So just as an introduction, as Rocco said, my name is Alan Barnard. I'm CEO of Goldratt Research Labs, and we have the privilege of working with organizations around the world, both private and public sector, to identify what are the main avoidable and consequential decisions, mistakes they can make, and to come up with the simplest, lowest cost, lowest risk way of avoiding these. So it's a great privilege to share some of these insights that we've gained, not just during this crisis, but also in previous. So to start off with, just three big mistakes that we can make. The first one is when we think that something will never happen or never happen to us, we don't prepare. I want to make it very clear. I've seen a lot of people in the press talk about this COVID-19 crisis as a black swan. It is not a black swan. It was a white swan, and that is Nassim Taleb's words that wrote the Black Swan as well. This is the third coronavirus that we've had in 3 decades. The previous ones had about 10,000 cases, each about 1,000 people that unfortunately passed away. We were just unlucky with this one in that the virus remains asymptomatic for about a week or 2, and during that time it can spread dramatically, whereas all the others you become symptomatic or almost immediately, and it's very easy to quarantine people through social distancing and wearing masks. So this was not a black swan, it was a white swan, and we were not prepared. We could have been prepared. The second big mistake that we make is when we think that something is impossible to achieve, something that looks like a very ambitious target, we often don't even try. The ability to survive and capitalize on this crisis is such an ambitious target. And I want to encourage you to try and hopefully the strategies that we've shared during the session will help to prepare you for how to not just survive, but also to thrive. And then the last mistake that we can make is often when a crisis happens, we end up having to break the rules in order to get out of the crisis. Things that we would never have done suddenly becomes the only logical choice, the only rational choice. Suddenly we start sharing buffers. Suddenly we figure out ways of achieving something that normally takes us months to do in a couple of days. But then the big mistake is when the crisis is over, we go back to use the old rules again. And we never for 1 minute think about the fact that what if these new rules that got us out of the crisis, if we had used them all the time, could they have helped us to prevent the crisis in the first place? A simple thing that I think all supply chain practitioners will have some experience in is, when a customer phones up and say, I want 1,000 of your widgets, normally the salespeople try to convince them to take 2,000 by offering them a special discount, etc. But when you have a shortage and suddenly that same customer phones in and says they want 1,000, you immediately ask them, how much do you really need right now? What if we shipped to you 250 a week? Would that be okay? But then, of course, the crisis is over. You go back to trying to convince them to take 2,000. Why not use those rules all the time? Why not use this as an opportunity to really convince all of our supply chain partners to switch more over to a demand-driven basis? So that's just a brief summary. What I'm going to do in the presentation, I've got about 10 minutes or so remaining. Just going to share with you briefly what are the recovery scenarios that we've been modeling with our clients using advanced simulation models to help them understand what those scenarios are. But also, secondly, what is the operational and financial impact of each of those scenarios? And what are the mistakes that we can make? And are there simple strategies to avoid those mistakes? So those are the 4 things that I will cover. So what are the possible scenarios? We've given them letters of the alphabet, right? So V represents this light green, which basically represents a fast and quite a relatively full recovery in terms of the demand on the organization. Recovery, but still a full recovery to what you were before. L is the scary one. That is essentially no recovery or substantially less demand than what we've previously held. And then the J part is a kind of a 2x or 3x recovery, is that there's something that happened during the crisis that got us to dramatically pivot, and now we can fully capitalize on it, and we can take our business maybe to the next level, or our organization to the next level. So a couple of weeks ago, I sent out a poll both via LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And we asked, the first poll asked, whatever organization you work with, which of these do you think most likely represent what will happen to your organization? And as you can see from the numbers, there were about 60% of people thought that this would be a slow but full recovery. There were some that thought it would be fast, some that thought they wouldn't recover, and a small percentage of organizations that they thought that they could somehow capitalize on this. Maybe suddenly people realized the importance of some product or service that they provide, and in future they'd be able to sell more, or maybe even get premium prices for these products. The second poll was, what about you as an individual, your own career? Whether you are an employee or whether you're a manager of a company, or even you run your own business. And we asked the same question, what would be the change in demand? And as you can see, some important differences. Many more thought that they would end up with an L shape, that they would be left severely worse off than before the crisis. And those are the things that's really worrying, is you can understand why so many people are going through serious a mental health crisis at the moment, and why the unemployment rate, I think the numbers are being released today. It's the worst it's been in a very, very long time. I think the contraction in the GDP for UK, apparently today they announced it's the worst it's been in 300 years. So terrible situation. And we see that happening in many different industries. Some of the previous speakers have shared some, Miguel have shared some. This is, for example, you see these shapes of recoveries in the same passenger car industry, but different patterns of recoveries and different impacts it would be. What I will share now is just one of the simulations that we've done for one of our customers. It's a company that has about $600 million in sales and about 60 million in profit, so very healthy profit, about 10% net profit, which is one of the best in their industry. And all that we did was we looked at, great, so what could be the likely outcomes if it happened as a V, U, L, and J shape? And we changed the numbers that they had in place for both the revenues, but also the costs on a monthly basis, and wanted to see what the impact would be of this on their financials. So the V shape would end up reducing their revenues by about 18%, the U shape 23%, L shape 41%, J shape 13. And you can see the impact on that on the revenues. But now you can see the impact it will have on the net profit. The worst case scenario, L shape, will take them from +10 to -11 in net profit. The best case scenario, J shape, will get them back to only about 4%. So we explored some options there for them. For example, if they made a substantial change in their product mix, and as well as to focus more on time-sensitive markets rather than price-sensitive markets, they could probably get their average selling price up by about 10%. So 10% of the 525 is another 50-odd million that will drop to the bottom line. So there is a possibility that they could actually end up in a better position than what they started if they were willing to explore the numbers. A big thing to note here that we're always calculating is how much cash runway these organizations have got. This is not just important for a startup, it's important even for the biggest companies. You could be highly profitable on average, but run out of cash during a crisis like this when your demand collapses down to zero. So very important to know what the cash runway is. It's also important to know your stock levels. So somebody would be reporting, I've got 30 days of stock. But during a pandemic, that 30 days of stock could be 3 days of stock. So you constantly have to update those demand forecasts in order to calculate how much coverage do we really have in all the critical items that we've got. So what are the big mistakes that we can make? And we've got limited time today, but I've included this in the slides. This is a framework I've developed to help our clients think through the types of key decisions that they can make and what are those decisions, and then what are the avoidable decision mistakes they can make and how best to reduce those avoidable mistakes. So 3 types of decisions. Planning decisions are decisions we make before we start the work. Execution decisions, decisions while we're doing the work, and measurement and improvement is decisions we make after we've completed the work. So the first big decision in planning is how do we allocate resources and buffers to reliably meet demand at the lowest cost? Then how do we make reliable commitments and prioritize the release of work? Should we change priorities? Should we expedite, use a fast track option? Those are all execution decisions. Should we batch to achieve efficiencies or not? What should we measure, what not? And finally, when and where we should make improvements or changes and investments. So I want to focus just on a few of these mistakes. So in the allocation of resources or buffers, the biggest mistake is when you have self-imposed demand, when you're offering clients a discount and that artificially causes a demand spike, or you create a feeling of scarcity and get people to overreact and buy way too much than what they need. So during a crisis, it's like that rule that I mentioned, is when they phone back to say, look, you're ordering 1,000, we noticed that you've never consumed more than 200, you really need more than 200. That can help to reduce some of those demand volatility that's often self-imposed. And then the other part is the misallocation of resources based on demand forecast or local buffering. You know, we have all the tools available today that we can dynamically allocate resources and make sure that we are aggregating the buffers. One of my friends, she's a top virologist in New York, and she mentioned to me that the shortages that they suffered from in PPE, personal protective equipment, dates back to a decade ago when the last coronavirus hit, and they just never maintained those buffer levels. They didn't aggregate them. They were localized, etc. So those are type of mistakes. In the making of commitments, you should always consider the backlog. If there's no backlog, you could potentially respond much faster. If there's a big backlog, you'd have to change the times that you're quoting your clients. So each of these, there's a specific mistake that people can make when it comes to this decision. And then there's a principle that we can use, and you'll notice the title at the top there is that principles are universal. Best practices or applications are specific. So demand-driven, focusing on flow, that's universally applicable to everybody. Focus on the flow. Make sure that you are only supplying based on what's really being consumed. Make sure you don't waste your resources to push it downstream when you could have kept it in an aggregated way and only dynamically allocated based on what the real need is. So each of these things, and again, as I mentioned, we've got limited time, but you can have a look at each of these. What is the mistake that you can make? And often the mistake is that we consider the local impact and not the total impact. As Henry, for example, mentioned, is that we look at purchasing far away because it will save us $1 per unit, and we buy 1 million of these, so we assume we'll save $1 million. But we should have considered what the total cost impact is of buying somewhere where they are 3-4 months away. I have to pay upfront compared to maybe buying locally. So that's where the simulation modeling part comes in very importantly, because we can measure the total impact of local decisions and see, is it a good idea or not? And really abolishing all these local efficiencies that are often just distracting us because it's generating a lot of noise, and really focusing those continuous improvement efforts on where it really matters. And a very important part that I'll share later is dynamically resizing buffers. It's a really important one, not just stock buffers based on what's really happening on the demand, but also time buffers, capacity buffers, and cash buffers. We should constantly be looking at, do we have sufficient protection against the possible risks that we are incurring? One of these mistakes, I think, some of our speakers might have referred to that as, this is your company situation. You've got pretty good lead times, your reliability is exceptional, throughput is great, but then this vicious cycle is triggered and you think that we should be okay. But what happens is you quickly get into chaos when the demand exceeds the supply. And when it gets to this above 80% levels, we all know it, that the lead times will grow exponentially, your reliability will drop, and your throughput will even start dropping. So it's really critical to stay away from these vicious cycles of people panic buying, over ordering. That causes overproduction on the suppliers. That triggers longer lead times. Those longer lead times will update my min-max stock levels, which will trigger larger replenishment orders and cause me to over-order even more on a system that's already constrained. So really the recovery part, we have to be very careful. We have to work closely with our suppliers and our customers to build up stock levels to prevent everybody's replenishment orders to be triggered and then these massive orders. Because what often happens is that the demand then spikes up, the suppliers panic, they bring in a lot of capacity, and just when they've got that new capacity deployed, suddenly the orders dry up and it returns to where they would normally. Or the opposite action is that the retailers or distributors panic, they stop ordering completely, the suppliers, manufacturers panic, they start cutting out capacity, laying off people, stopping production lines, and just when all of that is done, the consumption comes back to normal again and people start placing normal orders again, and suddenly they don't have the capacity to supply, and that's where a massive amount of market share could be lost. And that's what they always say is most market shares are gained and lost during crises like what we are facing at the moment. So I want to end off with just a really useful framework. I mentioned Black Swan. Nassim Taleb wrote this amazing book called Anti-Fragile, and he said it's important to look at systems, whether it's an organization, a person, or country, not as whether they're effective or efficient or compliant, but rather to look at how they would cope with stresses onto them, both positive and negative stresses. And he came up with a very useful classification of, is a system fragile, robust, or anti-fragile? A fragile system is harmed more by losses than what it benefits from equivalent gains. So a single person business, for example, if suddenly the demand goes up too much, maybe 50%, they've got limited gain because they've got a capacity constraint. But if they lose 50% of their business, they could potentially go bankrupt. So they hurt much more by a downturn or failure than what they benefit from an equivalent gain or upturn. A robust system doesn't really care. It's equally harmed by a downturn or an upturn, and over time it just balances out. But an anti-fragile one is one that has figured out the rules to protect itself against a downturn, but fully capitalize on the upturn. And I think that's an important concept to take forward, is to say, how can we learn from this crisis? We have to be prepared. We need to put in policies where we can work very closely with our supply chain partners to identify and simulate what are the scenarios that can happen to us. The fact that we can't predict when it will happen doesn't mean it won't happen. What are those scenarios? What would be the financial impact, and how can we work together to protect ourselves against them if they're the worst case, but also how best as a supply chain to capitalize on it if we are lucky that crisis caused a dramatic increase in demand. The second part is sharing our end product sales. I think a number of the speakers have mentioned this, as we have no longer any excuse not to do that. We need to get everybody onto demand driven, so that when a product is consumed by a consumer, that signal should be sent to everybody so that we can all track what's really happening on the demand side, rather than keep on pushing based on forecast that was based on previous assumptions. And the other part is to have a single priority system, to have these buffers that are dynamically adjusted all the time. Here are examples of these demand-driven and theory of constraints-based algorithms that can happen automatically. So you can see during a stable demand pattern, the buffers would stay about the same. If you are launching a new product, it would start off very high and very quickly stabilize down to lower levels. If there's a demand spike that maybe those that have experienced in the PPE, or those that manufacture ventilators and others, these dynamic algorithms would automatically detect that the demand is much more or that the supply is taking longer and automatically increase target stock levels. And once the crisis is over or the demand spike is over, it would automatically go down. So that's kind of the message I want to leave you with, is that I mentioned be prepared, work with everybody. And here just an issue around, there's a lot of things that are not known at the moment. There's a lot of uncertainties. But these only really matter if it will change how best to solve, resolve, cope with, or capitalize on the situation. We know, regardless of these unknowns and uncertainties, what is the best way to move forward, both as an individual, wear a mask, wash your hands. Those are the things that, regardless of many factors around this pandemic that we don't yet fully understand, are good strategies to follow. In the same way as the supply chain, there's many unknowns and uncertainties, but we know the mistakes that we can make, and there are simple principles that we can apply to avoid these mistakes. And then the last one is, when demand exceeds supply, of course, we should find the bottleneck and make sure that we don't waste its scarce capacity. But when that demand is growing exponentially, at the same time, we should be looking at starting to look for more bottles, elevating that, and looking at all the various options that we've got available to try and get more of that scarce resource. So I hope that was valuable. I'll hand back to Rocco to find out if there's any questions on the slides.